Have you ever paused at the sight of a lotus? Not just seen it, but truly noticed it. There it stands, delicate, serene, pure. But beneath its beauty lies a truth that most people miss. It was born in mud. Thick, dark, decaying mud. And yet, it rises, unafraid of the dirt, unaffected by the filth, untouched by the very mess that gave it life. This is not just a flower, it's a teaching, a silent scripture written in petals. In the heart of Buddhism, the lotus is no ordinary plant. It is the symbol of enlightenment, the embodiment of a spirit that refuses to be stained by the world's chaos. Because let's be honest, life is muddy. We swim through stress, disappointment, jealousy, pressure. We scroll endlessly, measure ourselves against pixel-perfect people, and drown in thoughts we can't even name. The world pulls us in every direction, but somehow we're still not going anywhere. It's in this exact mess that the lotus whispers its secret. You don't have to wait for the world to be clean before you bloom. You don't need to escape the mud. You need to rise through it, not in denial, not in resistance, but in grace. And there was someone just like you who tried to do exactly that. Her name was Mira, not a monk, not a nun, not a master, just a regular woman in her late 20s, navigating the rush of deadlines, broken dreams, social expectations, and that unshakable feeling of not being enough. She wasn't seeking enlightenment. She was just looking to breathe. One rainy afternoon, while sitting on a park bench with a mind that felt louder than the storm, she noticed a lotus blooming from a shallow, murky pond nearby. It didn't ask for better conditions. It simply bloomed anyway. That image haunted her. It became the first quiet question in a world that never stopped shouting, "Can I live like that? Can I be in this world without being consumed by it? Can I exist in chaos but move with calm? Can I walk through the mud without dragging it into my soul?" Mira didn't have the answers, but the lotus did. It always did. This journey you're about to take, it's not a spiritual escape. It's not about leaving life behind. It's about showing up in it differently. It's about learning from the flower that doesn't run from the mud, but transforms through it. You'll walk alongside Mira. You'll see your own struggles reflected in hers. And through her story and the wisdom of Buddhist teachings, you'll begin to see what it truly means to rise, to bloom, to live untouched by the mud, not because the mud disappears, but because you discover something within you that no mud can reach. So take a breath, let the noise soften, let the water settle, because what you're about to uncover isn't just a lesson. It's a remembering. The lotus has been waiting for you, and it's time to listen. Before we can talk about blooming, we need to talk about mud, not metaphorically, but truthfully, because mud is more than just the mess. It's the pain we try to hide. It's the loss that never quite healed. It's the weight of expectations, the sting of rejection, the quiet ache of feeling unseen. It's every moment Mira sat in a room full of people and still felt alone. Every night she stared at the ceiling, her mind looping a highlight reel of what went wrong. It's not dramatic, it's not always tragic, but it's constant. And for a long time, Mira believed something was broken in her, until she stumbled upon an ancient truth. One the Buddha spoke under the shade of a Bodhi tree more than 2,500 years ago. Life is dukkha, suffering, impermanence, dissatisfaction, not as a punishment, not as something to fix, but as the starting point. You see, suffering isn't a flaw in the design, it is the design. Not because the universe is cruel, but because suffering awakens us, like the mud that nourishes the lotus. Pain breaks the shell of the ego, so that truth can take root. But here's the twist most people miss. The Buddha never said, "You must suffer." He said, "You will suffer." And that difference matters. Mira began to notice how suffering crept in, not just during the big heartbreaks, but in the smallest moments. When her coffee spilled on a clean shirt before a meeting, when her text was left on read, when she compared her behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. Each time a flicker of dukkha, each time an invitation to look deeper. The mud, she realized, was not the enemy, it was the teacher. And like any teacher, it wanted to be understood, not avoided. In Buddhism, suffering comes in many flavors: the suffering of pain, the suffering of change, the suffering of simply being alive. Even pleasure, yes, even joy, carries suffering within it. Because it's fleeting. It slips through your fingers the moment you try to hold it too tight. But here's the profound gift Mira uncovered. When you stop running from the mud, you stop sinking in it. She learned to sit with her pain, not drown in it, to name it, not judge it, to see suffering not as a curse, but as the cracked soil where the lotus could begin to grow. And perhaps the most radical idea of all, she didn't have to wait until life got easier to find peace. She just had to stop resisting what already was. That shift changed everything. Because the moment she stopped pretending the mud wasn't there, she realized it had never been trying to hurt her. It was trying to wake her up. To what? To the truth she had forgotten, that inside the mud, there's stillness. Inside the suffering, there's space. And in that space, if you're still enough, you might just hear something whisper, "This too belongs." All of it, the sorrow, the chaos, the longing, the cracks in your voice when you try to be strong, it all belongs. Because the mud doesn't stop the lotus from blooming, it makes it possible. And as Mira sat with this new knowing, she felt something subtle shift. She hadn't escaped the mud, but she had stopped fearing it. And sometimes, that's where the real blooming begins. Every lotus bloom begins in a place no one ever sees. Beneath the surface, beneath the mud, beneath even the water. It begins in the dark, and it's here, hidden from the eyes of the world, that something sacred happens. The root takes hold. Before beauty, before color, before the delicate unfolding of petals under sunlight, there is only one quiet task: anchor yourself in the unseen. Mira didn't know it yet, but her healing wasn't going to begin in the glow of candles or under the sky of mountain retreats. It began in her loneliest moments, in the 2 a.m. silence where she finally stopped trying to be okay, in the tears that fell quietly in a bathroom stall where no one could hear, in the stillness between heartbreak and hope. She thought she was falling apart, but really, she was taking root. Darkness in our culture is feared. It's labeled as weakness, sadness, failure. But in Buddhism, darkness is not something to avoid. It's something to enter with presence. Because the dark is not empty, it is where potential gathers, where the soul whispers the loudest, where the illusion of control dies so that truth can finally breathe. You can't skip the dark and expect to be whole. The lotus can't bloom without it. The deeper the mud, the stronger the root. The darker the path, the clearer the light becomes when it finally arrives. There's a reason the lotus is rooted in the dirtiest waters, yet becomes the symbol of purity. Because it doesn't avoid the filth. It transforms through it, and Mira was beginning to understand. Her pain wasn't a detour from the path. It was the path. One evening, she sat in her small apartment with the lights off. No phone in her hand, no music playing, just her breath, echoing in the still air. For the first time, she didn't fight the silence, she entered it, and in that quiet, she didn't find answers. She found something more powerful, a willingness to stay, not to escape, not to numb, but to be with what was raw, unfiltered, real. That moment didn't fix her life, but it planted something, a root of stillness, a thread of calm, a knowing that even in the darkest places she was still alive. And that aliveness didn't come from pretending to be okay. It came from being real. In Zen, they say, The obstacle is the path. The mud isn't in the way. The dark isn't something to get through quickly. It is the sacred womb of transformation. No one claps when the root grows underground. No one posts about the days you simply showed up and breathed through the ache. But those are the days the soul is building its foundation. Those are the moments the lotus begins to form. And Mira, she was beginning to feel it. Not in some grand epiphany, but in the smallest shift, a breath that came easier, a thought that didn't spiral, a moment of silence that didn't feel like punishment anymore. She wasn't blooming yet, but she was growing in the dark. And that was enough. Growth doesn't begin when you reach the surface. It begins when you decide to rise. Mira had spent weeks simply sitting with herself. No expectations, no rush, just presence. But something inside her shifted. Not a loud, life-altering moment, but a quiet stirring, like the first push of the lotus stem rising through the mud. Soft but determined, the darkness was still there, but so was something else now, direction. She didn't just want to survive her suffering. She wanted to walk through it with wisdom. And it was in the pages of an old, weathered book from her grandfather's shelf that she found the map, the noble eightfold path, 8 steps. Simple yet profound, not rules, not commandments, but a path, a way of walking that doesn't just escape suffering. It transforms it, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Not a staircase to climb, but a circle to walk, again and again, until the mind becomes still, and the heart remembers what it means to be free. Mira didn't try to master them all at once. She simply began. She started with right view, learning to see things as they are, not as she wished them to be. No longer labeling her emotions as good or bad, but simply seeing. Suffering wasn't her enemy, it was her teacher. Then came right intention. She asked herself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Was it fear, approval, or truth? And that small question began to untangle years of people-pleasing, overthinking, self-doubt. Day by day, she moved from reacting to responding. From running to returning. She wasn't perfect. Sometimes she'd slip back into old habits, but the stem kept rising because she was no longer just surviving, she was practicing. Right speech taught her to speak with kindness, even to herself. Right action reminded her to honor her values, even when no one was watching. Right livelihood nudged her to question the work she did, not just how she earned, but how she contributed. And slowly this path, this quiet, humble way of living, became less of a spiritual concept and more of a compass. When anxiety returned, she returned to right effort, not overworking to fix herself, but gently realigning. When the noise of the world grew loud, she anchored in right mindfulness, one breath, one step, one moment at a time. And when the storms of life stirred again, she closed her eyes and leaned into right concentration, not to escape, but to arrive in herself, in this breath, in this becoming. The lotus doesn't rise in a straight line, it sways, it bends with the water, it dances with the current, but always it rises. So did Mira. Not because she forced herself out of pain, but because she chose to walk with it, step by mindful step. The noble path didn't promise her a perfect life. It gave her something deeper, a rooted freedom. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind that rises from within. And as she sipped tea one quiet morning, watching the steam curl like prayer into the air, Mira smiled, not because she had reached the surface, but because she now trusted her way through the mud. You don't need to chase the light, because one day, you realize it's always been inside you. Mira sat beneath the Bodhi tree behind the temple, where yellow leaves danced in the breeze like whispered prayers. She had followed the path, stumbled, risen again. She had cried into the mud and smiled into the wind. And now, something was opening. It wasn't dramatic, no lightning from the sky, no booming voice of truth, just stillness. A silence so deep it felt like listening to the pulse of the universe. And in that silence, she felt it not outside but within, a warmth, a knowing, a light, soft, ancient, familiar. She didn't become enlightened. She remembered that she already was. The lotus doesn't bloom because it tries to impress. It blooms because that is its nature. And so it was with Mira. No more pretending, no more proving. She was not her trauma, not her guilt, not her past, nor her perfection. She was awareness itself, the same awareness that watches waves rise and fall, the same awareness that holds joy and sorrow in the same breath. This is not about becoming something else. It's about peeling back everything you are not. We spend our lives collecting ideas, identities, achievements, opinions, labels. But the lotus teaches us something else entirely. To bloom is to shed the masks, to shed the noise, to shed even the idea that you need to be fixed. Because you are not broken, you are just buried. And every breath, every step on the path, every moment of mindfulness is a gentle brushing away of the mud until your true nature shines. Like the lotus, you are born to rise, you are born to open. You are born to be still and radiant in a restless world. This blossoming is not loud, not viral, not flashy, but it changes everything. Because once your inner light awakens, you see that it was never just about you. You begin to see the light in others, even in those lost in their own mud, even in those who hurt you, even in the parts of yourself you once rejected. And that's when compassion is born. Not as pity, but as connection. Mira looked into the eyes of a stranger at the temple gate, and in that moment, no words, no explanation. They saw each other, really saw. Two beings walking each other home. This is the flowering of the lotus. It's the return to simplicity, to wholeness, to truth. Not some unreachable mountaintop, but a quiet space in the center of your chest. A place where there's nothing to hide, and nothing left to prove, just breath, just presence, just being. The mud no longer scares you because now you know. The mud was never the enemy, it was the womb. And this light, this quiet, indestructible glow that now lives in Mira's eyes. It lives in you too, waiting. A flower doesn't speak, it doesn't preach, doesn't argue, doesn't need to be understood. It simply exists, in full bloom, in full presence, and that is its teaching. The lotus does not ask the mud to be cleaner. It does not rush the process of rising. It doesn't compare itself to other flowers or panic when petals take time to open. It waits, it grows, it trusts. And if we're willing to pause even for a breath, we begin to hear its wisdom. Not with our ears, but with something deeper. The lotus says, be patient with your becoming. We live in a world obsessed with speed. How fast we succeed, how quickly we heal, how soon we figure it all out. But the lotus doesn't rush. Its roots twist through darkness. Its stem stretches through murky water, and its blossom only opens when it's ready. You don't need to bloom by someone else's timeline. Healing is not a race. Awakening is not a competition. You are unfolding, and that is enough. Then it says, you can be in the mud and still be pure. So many of us carry shame, regret for what we've done, fear of being unworthy, the weight of our own imperfections. But look at the lotus. It grows in filth, in decay, in water that no one would drink. Yet its petals are pristine, untouched, sacred. Why? Because purity is not about where you come from. It's about who you choose to be despite it. No past mistake defines your soul. No environment controls your destiny. You may have been surrounded by darkness, but you are not darkness. You are the light that rises through it. Another lesson: growth is silent. The lotus doesn't shout as it grows. It doesn't announce every inch of progress. It just keeps reaching upward. Our culture rewards noise. The loudest voice, the flashiest success, the biggest platform. But the lotus reminds us, true growth often happens when no one is watching. In the quiet, in the solitude, in the ordinary moments when you choose to keep going, even when it's hard. You don't need applause to be evolving. You don't need witnesses to become whole. The stem rises, even if no one sees it. And perhaps its most beautiful teaching: you are meant to bloom not just for you, but for the world. When the lotus finally blossoms, it doesn't ask for praise. It doesn't say, "Look at me." It just offers itself, its beauty, its fragrance, its stillness. It becomes a gift. And that's what we're here for too, not to prove our worth, not to dominate or impress, but to offer kindness when it's least expected, to offer presence in a distracted world, to offer love when it's hard to give. Your awakening is not just for you. It's for everyone who crosses your path, because when you rise, you quietly give others permission to do the same. Mira once believed that awakening was a solo path, but now she sees. Every petal she opens helps someone else believe they can too, like ripples in a still pond, like light passed from one candle to the next. This is how the world changes, not all at once, not with noise and spectacle, but one open heart at a time. So listen to the lotus. It doesn't demand your attention. It just reminds you. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not alone. You are rising. And you are exactly where you need to be. She wakes before the sun, not because she's enlightened, but because anxiety got there first. Emails waiting, deadlines looming, a phone buzzing with artificial urgency. This is Mira, 35, marketing manager. Once a dreamer, now a doer. Once a poet, now a scheduler of Zoom meetings and coffee-fueled productivity. She used to meditate under starlight. Now she scrolls under fluorescent screens. She used to write in journals. Now she writes reports, PowerPoints, presentations, pitches. The mud in her world doesn't smell like decay. It smells like burnt coffee, fear of failure, and the stale breath of self-doubt. But still, somewhere deep inside, a lotus refuses to die. Not a metaphor, not a cliché, a quiet truth. One evening, after another long day of being fine, Mira finds herself sitting in her car, parked in silence. She doesn't cry, she doesn't scream, she just breathes. And in that breath, she remembers a line from a book she once loved: "Be like the lotus, untouched by the mud." She smirks. "Easy for a flower," she whispers, "but what about me?" And right there in that question, something breaks open, not her spirit, her story. For so long she thought being spiritual meant escaping the mud, being calm all the time, saying the right things, always smiling. But the lotus doesn't avoid the mud, it grows through it, and so can she. The next morning, nothing outside changes. Still the same deadlines, still the same noise, still the same fast-paced jungle of modern life. But Mira does one thing different before touching her phone. She touches her breath, just one, in, out, then another. She gets up slower, sips her tea with both hands, not rushing, just present. At lunch, instead of eating at her desk, she steps outside. One tree, one sky, one moment of silence. She begins talking to herself like she would a child. "Hey, I see you're tired. It's okay. You don't need to bloom today. Just keep reaching." And slowly, not in fireworks but in tiny sparks, she remembers who she is. She is not just a manager. She is not just a to-do list in human form. She is a soul with roots in the invisible. She still makes mistakes, still snaps at her coworkers sometimes, still forgets to meditate, but she's learning. That awakening is not a destination. It's a direction. That rising doesn't mean never falling. It means choosing to get up again without shame. That strength is not how much you carry, but how gently you carry yourself. And one day at a team meeting, someone asks her, "Mira, how are you so calm these days?" She pauses. She doesn't mention Buddhism or meditation or anything spiritual. She simply says, "I stopped trying to avoid the mud." And the room goes quiet, because her presence says more than her words ever could. Mira is not a guru. She's not enlightened. She still forgets to breathe sometimes, but she is becoming a mirror. A reminder that living like a lotus doesn't require robes, incense, or mantras chanted in caves. It just requires intention, a breath, a willingness to rise again and again from whatever mud we find ourselves in. Because the mud is not the enemy, the mud is the invitation, and in the falling rain, something sacred whispers, you don't have to escape your life to wake up. You just have to show up fully, gently, and with love. The modern world is addicted to proof. We want brain scans, peer-reviewed journals, double-blind studies. We want to see it, measure it, verify it. And fair enough. In a world flooded with noise, truth needs to stand on solid ground. But here's a beautiful thing. What the Buddha intuited 2,500 years ago, modern science is just beginning to confirm. Let's begin with the mind. When the Buddha spoke of mindfulness, sati in Pali, he wasn't offering a productivity hack. He was offering a path to liberation. And yet today, across prestigious labs and neuroscience centers, scientists are arriving at the same door he opened with silence. MRI scans of long-term meditators show physical changes. Yes, structural changes. In regions of the brain associated with attention, compassion, emotional regulation. The amygdala, that fiery center of fight or flight, shrinks with regular mindfulness practice. The prefrontal cortex, the wise elder of the brain, thickens, strengthening our ability to pause, reflect, and choose rather than react. The lotus, it turns out, is not just a metaphor. It's biological, but the convergence goes deeper. Modern psychology speaks of cognitive distortions, all-or-nothing thinking, catastrophizing, personalization. The Buddha called these kailsas mental defilements, delusions, grasping, aversion, ego. Today's therapists help clients reframe thoughts. The Buddha taught right view, seeing clearly without the fog of self-clinging. One uses cognitive behavioral therapy, the other uses meditation. Different tools. Same goal, freedom from mental suffering. Even physics whispers echoes of Dharma. The more we zoom in, the less solid the world appears. Matter is not solid. Particles blink in and out of existence. Time is not linear. Reality is not fixed. Buddhism has long said, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. The self is not a fixed entity. It is a process, a stream of ever-changing moments. In this way, science and Dharma do not compete. They converge. Science explains the how. Buddhism asks why. Science observes the outer world. Buddhism trains the inner observer. One builds rockets to reach other planets. The other builds stillness to reach the vastness within. And yet both are, in essence, curious. Both demand humility. Both require patience. Because true wisdom, whether through a microscope or a meditation cushion, begins with the same realization. We do not yet know everything. Now imagine Mira, yes, from the last chapter. She begins reading about neuroscience out of curiosity. She sees an fMRI of a meditating monk. She learns about neuroplasticity, about how the mind is trainable, about how breath, awareness, and compassion change not just emotions but biology. And it clicks. This is not superstition. This is not blind faith. This is training the instrument of perception itself. She smiles. because suddenly sitting in silence isn't doing nothing. It's rewiring her entire nervous system. She is not retreating from the world, she is evolving within it. But here's the deeper insight. Science can show us what is happening, but only experience can tell us what it means. You can measure dopamine levels, but you can't measure the feeling of letting go. You can monitor brain waves, but you can't quantify awakening. And so we must let them work together. Let science keep asking its noble questions. Let Buddhism keep offering its timeless answers. And in that sacred middle space, we find the modern lotus, rooted in evidence, blossoming in wisdom, unafraid to blend data with dharma, logic with love. The Buddha once said, "Believe nothing unless it agrees with your own reason and experience." And now science says the same. So we are not choosing between old and new, east and west, mystic and rational. We are finally remembering. Truth has many languages, and when they sing in harmony, the song is unforgettable. Let's get real. It's one thing to admire the lotus. It's another thing to become the lotus. When the mud of life pulls at your feet every morning, deadlines, bills, noise, negativity, loneliness, temptation, pain, the mud is real. But so is the path out of it. And you don't need to be a monk on a mountain to walk that path. You don't even need incense. You need presence. You need choice. You need a few sacred habits that water the roots of your being every single day. So let's break it down. Not as a theory but a practice. Not as a sermon but a lifestyle. Here is how to live like a lotus. Begin your day with stillness, not screens. Before you check the world, check in with yourself. Even 5 minutes of silent sitting, deep breathing, or gratitude reflection can shift your entire nervous system. This isn't being spiritual, it's rewiring your morning mindset. It's saying, I am the author of today's energy. Sit, breathe in, feel the breath. Let your thoughts pass like clouds and remind yourself, I am not the mud, I am the one who grows through it. 2. Walk through the world but do wear it. The lotus lives in the mud but stays unstained. This isn't poetry, it's instruction. It means when gossip circles around you, you don't echo it. When anger rises in someone's voice, you don't absorb it. When the news spins fear, you return to breath, not panic. This is your invisible lotus petal, a boundary of awareness. Say silently, I feel it but I won't become it. That's strength, that's discipline, that's freedom. 3. Respond, don't react. Reacting is instinct. Responding is mindfulness. When someone cuts you off in traffic or insults you online, the mud flings itself at your peace. But here's the lotus path. Pause. Notice the fire rising. Breathe. Then choose. That space between stimulus and response is where your power lives. Say to yourself, I am not a slave to emotion. I am a witness and a master of my own mind. 4. Speak with clarity and compassion. Words are petals. Once spoken, they float into the minds of others, sometimes staying there forever. Before you speak, ask, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? That ancient Buddhist filter still holds. Your speech can be mud or water or sunlight. Choose wisely. 5. Turn pain into growth. Every scar you carry is a buried root. If you sit with it, breathe with it, you'll find that even suffering has something to teach. When you feel sadness, ask, what part of me is longing for healing? When you feel anger, ask, what wound am I protecting? When you feel jealousy, ask, what am I afraid I don't have enough of? Pain isn't the end. It's fertilizer if you dare to compost it. 6. Let go like leaves in autumn. The lotus doesn't cling to the mud it grew through. It rises not by force but by release. Let go of needing to be right. Let go of comparing your timeline to others. Let go of old grudges, worn-out roles, and the version of yourself you've outgrown. Say, thank you for what you taught me. I release you now. Freedom begins not when we control more, but when we carry less. 7. End the day in reflection, not distraction. Before bed, don't scroll, don't numb, don't escape. Just sit, close your eyes and ask, where was I peaceful today? Where was I pulled into mud? What did I learn about myself? What can I offer forgiveness for, including to myself? Then say softly, tomorrow I rise again. That's how a lotus sleeps, not in regret, but in readiness. You see, to live like a lotus isn't about being perfect. It's about staying rooted in practice, committed to rise, and faithful to your own unfolding. You don't have to escape the mud. You just have to remember, you were never the mud to begin with, and every choice you make, every breath you take in awareness, every time you pause instead of lash out, release instead of cling, you are becoming the lotus. Not one day, but today. Maybe, just maybe, the lotus isn't asking you to admire it. Maybe it's whispering, be me. Not in image, but in essence, not in theory, but in truth, because somewhere within you, beneath the noise, beneath the bruises, beneath the doubts, there's already a seed that remembers light. Even when buried in shadow, it doesn't need fixing, it needs space. It doesn't need speed, it needs stillness. It doesn't ask you to bloom overnight, it only asks one thing. Don't stop rising. We began this journey in the mud, acknowledging pain, confusion, and the heaviness of being human. We looked at the dark, not to avoid it, but to understand it, because only what's seen clearly can be transformed. We spoke of the root, how everything real begins beneath the surface, and that growth isn't always visible, but always vital. We followed the stem, the noble path of integrity, awareness, and discipline, where each choice becomes a silent rebellion against chaos. We opened into the blossom, awakening not perfection, but presence, compassion, clarity. We listened to ancient lessons and modern stories. We stood at the intersection of science and spirituality, east and west, form and formlessness. And then we turned it all practical, because truth that cannot be lived is only decoration. Now here we are, not at an end, but a return. So what does it mean to be the lotus? It means to be still even when the world swirls, to be kind when it's easier to be cruel, to listen when everyone else is yelling, to let go when clinging feels safer, to rise not with arrogance but with grace, to walk through the mud and remain unsoiled, not because you're better, but because you're rooted in something deeper, quieter, truer. And if one day you doubt your strength, when the world pulls you down again, when the mud feels too thick, too cold, too much, remember this. The lotus does not bloom in spite of the mud. It blooms because of it. You're not broken, you're becoming, you're not late, you're unfolding, you're not behind, you're just beneath for now. Trust your roots, honor your rhythm, and never forget. The deepest wisdom grows in silence, the softest light shines from within, and the most powerful bloom rises without noise. Be the lotus, not for the world to see, but for your soul to know you rose anyway.